a Brian Rothery podcast. Writing to be published. Brian Rothery is a retired writer and journalist.
Writing to be published. By published, I also mean being broadcast, screened, or produced online. Now, first, my credentials. Why am I able to talk about this subject? Well, I've been doing it for 60 years, from the age of 26, and I'm now 86. And my record in that time is that I've had 21 books published, one of them in 16 translations, and a number of books in up to 12 translations. I've also written 3 literary novels for major British and American publishers, and I've had fiction published on the radio. What's probably most unusual in my work is that in the latter part of it, I had work published weekly online and was actually paid for it. Now, as to the number of articles that I've had published in newspapers and magazines, I've long ago lost count, but I'd say they run into the thousands. And these will include a weekly article which I wrote for 4 years for a national newspaper, and the number of columns that I wrote, weekly columns that I wrote for up to 6 months for other newspapers. Now, what's important also to say to you is that for the first half of this period of 60 years or more, that I, in addition to a very good income from writing, that I also had a senior job, so that my whole writing income came on top of my good salary. And I was working for companies like IBM, and I was a press officer for a major Irish government agency. At the age of 54, I achieved a lifelong ambition. I was able to give up employment for good, and I spent the next 20 years, up to my early 70s, as a full-time writer. Since I retired from writing for money, I have been doing voluntary work, and I've been published in connection with that also. Now I want to tell you a scary story. Back in the 1960s, when I was a young, recently published writer, I was asked to give advice to a lady who needed help in Dublin, a widow. And I went to see her, and she told me the following extraordinary story. She told me that a local agent who lived in Ireland and who worked for a major international vanity publisher had called to her door. Now, I knew this vanity publisher because I had seen their ads in magazines in both North America and Europe. And this local agent had called to her house and had said to her that he had heard that the previous year, it was the mid-1960s, that she had gone on a visit to her daughter in Australia. Her daughter had emigrated to Australia. And as jets had been flying from about 1960 onwards between Europe and Australia and between Europe and North America, it was now possible to go and visit your emigrated children. And this agent said to her that this was so unusual, what she had done, that his publisher was prepared to publish a book about it. And when she protested and said that she wouldn't know how to write a book, he said that, if necessary, they could also hire the services of a ghostwriter to help her write it. And when she further protested that she wouldn't even know what title to give it, he said that they already had a title, which was One Passport, One Pair of Eyes. She then took me upstairs to the attic and opened the attic door, and I looked in, and to my amazement, I saw inside at least 1,000 hardback copies of a book with One Passport, One Pair of Eyes on it. Now, what I couldn't say to the lady at the time, because I couldn't hurt her feelings, was that this vanity publisher, like all vanity publishers, had no interest in the editorial quality of the book, and because of this, no bookstore would take it. But I did have to say to her that the publisher's only interest in her was in taking her money and delivering the books to her, because her question to me was, how do I now get the books from my attic? Now that the publisher stops talking to me, communicating with me, how do I get the books from my attic to the bookstores or to readers? Now, this lady, unfortunately, had been conned. There was very little doubt about that. But in the decades that followed, I met a number of people who used and paid vanity publishers, knowing exactly what they did, because these people had very little interest in reaching readers. Their main interest was in demonstrating to their friends and family that they were writers, that they had books that were published, that they had book launches and so on, never mentioning that in fact they had paid for them. This is why, of course, it's called vanity publishing, because you pay out of vanity to get a book published and to be described as a writer. Now, having told that scary story, I will tell you that I see 3 reasons for writing, and I've had 3 reasons for writing, although the second reason, which I'll come to in a moment, is more a result than a reason. Now, the first and most important reason, by far, is that I wrote for money. Now, let me tell you what kind of money I mean. I mean the kind of money that puts food on the table, that keeps a roof over the head, that brings up a family, that sends them to school and to university, that pays the mortgage, that if you run into debt, you don't need to raise loans. If you do have to raise a loan, that you can easily pay it off. And in my case, above all, the reason was that it impressed my dear late wife and made her admire me. Now, the second, which is more a result than a reason, because you may not know what's going to happen, is that writing can lead to an improvement in one's career. Through writing, especially books, you can simply get a better job. And eventually, as in my case, you can be headhunted into a fairly senior job. And the third reason, which tends to come at the end of your career, or near the end, around the point where you don't need to write for money anymore, is that you can write for political, religious, spiritual, ideological, or other reasons, especially human rights reasons. In my case, I wrote because I believe there had been some miscarriages of justice which caused some innocent men to be put in prison. It also helped me with other human rights work that I was doing. Now, it might be useful for you, if you're interested, if I run through my own experience about how I became a writer and how I used it in my life. At the age of 23, in the middle of a deep recession in Ireland in 1957, I had to emigrate to Canada. I went 2 months ahead of my fiancée, who followed me. And on the day after I arrived, I had a job with one of the biggest companies in the country, Bell Telephone of Canada, which had 40,000 employees. As I say, my wife followed 2 months later. We got married and we settled down into an apartment in Montreal, which at the time was the leading metropolis in Canada, in Quebec. Now, Bell, like most large corporations, had its own house magazine, which was a monthly glossy called Bluebell. And being Irish, and therefore having a sense of humour and being somewhat articulate or literate, I wrote a couple of articles which I sent to the editor of the Bell magazine, of the Bluebell, and they were immediately published. Encouraged by this, I sent a number of short stories to a weekly programme on CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, to a morning radio programme called John Draney Presents, where John Draney, the presenter, was reading short stories. And each one of these short stories I sent was broadcast. And then magically, within a week or so after the broadcast, an envelope arrived at our apartment, and much to my dear late wife's admiration and pleasure, there was a cheque inside for $50. which made a very big impression on us. Around this time, the world's first computers had arrived, and I had started programming. And not only was I programming, I was also helping to lay out computer centres in both Montreal and Toronto. And I began to write a series of articles for a major international computer magazine called Data Processing, which was sold both in America and Canada and around the world. And for each one of these articles, which was each one being published, I would receive a check for $50. After 6 years with Bell, I transferred to IBM in Ireland, where I became a systems engineer, which was at the time one of the best jobs one could have. And I took the series of articles that I'd written on this subject and I turned them into chapters of a book, a very simple book called Installing and Managing a Computer. And I immediately sold it to a British and American publisher. And suddenly I was a published author working for IBM. I followed this up with 2 more books about computers and programming, which I co-authored. I then did something that all young writers want to do. I sent a literary novel to a major British publisher, and the publisher accepted it. And I was very interested to see the readers, the publisher's reviewer, the person who had read the novel for the publisher to advise the publisher on its quality. And in the review, it said that I was a young writer who had worked for IBM and that I also had published computer books. So it was clear that both my job and my fact that I had written computer books had an impact on the publisher in the acceptance of the novel. The novel was then subsequently taken up by a major American publisher and published on both sides of the Atlantic. I followed this up with 2 more novels. That was 3 altogether. And after that I had no more literary merit left in me. Or perhaps it was that I had at this stage discovered another very lucrative form of writing of books, that is, which was popular non-fiction. For example, I had wrote a book called How to Organise Your Time and Resources. I wrote one on what Europe would mean to Ireland when Ireland would enter the EEC, and I wrote a book on entrepreneurs in Ireland, on men who had started their own businesses. I say men because at the time I was writing about light engineering, and only men were starting light engineering businesses. Now, both the book about going into Europe and the book about entrepreneurs were widely publicised in the Irish media. I should also say that the computer books were widely mentioned in newspapers at the time because computers were all the rage, because they were new, and to be a computer expert meant that you got plenty of publicity. Now I found myself in a position where I was actually being headhunted. I was headhunted by a major state agency and offered a job as press officer. And I not only was I dealing with the media, but I was writing speeches for government ministers and even occasionally for the Prime Minister, known as the Taoiseach. The kind of speech I would write would be the one that would be necessary for major factory openings. For example, major American companies were opening factories in Ireland, and I would write the speech that the Minister or Prime Minister would give in the ceremony for the factory opening. At the age of 54, I achieved a lifelong ambition. I managed to give up employment forever. The mortgage was paid off, and the children had finished school and college, and we had acquired a small pension for life, which meant that it was reasonably safe for me to take this risk. And having given up employment, I went into full-time writing. But before I left my job, I took with me the paperwork for a new standard which had just been published by the International Standards Organization in Geneva, ISO. And this was the world's first quality management standard called ISO 9000. And in the first 3 months of my work as a writer, as a full-time writer, I sat in my newly constructed greenhouse and wrote a very simple book about how to implement this standard, simply called ISO 9000. The book was accepted by a British publisher and became my most successful book ever. It actually went into 16 translations. Now the irony of this is that every young writer and every writer wants to write a bestseller, or most do indeed. And I have myself had dreams and hopes that one day I might do so, and that the title would be something along the lines of the great American novel. Now, while it was not a bestseller along the lines of international bestsellers that go into the millions, it was a bestseller by business book standards and was described as a bestseller by the business book publisher because of each copy was selling for $50 to companies all over the world. But it was the number of translations that caused its popularity, and also the fact that many newspapers approached me looking for articles for which they paid me, and many magazines, because the subject was all the rage, especially with business journalists and business editors. This book by ISO was followed by their second management standard, which was the environmental management standard, ISO 14000. And I wrote the first book on this subject, again with the simple title of ISO 14000. Now, not only did this go into 12 translations, but it was once again very popular with newspaper editors. But major companies approached me, all of them in Ireland, and by major companies I mean large American companies, for example, and asked me to come into the company and to actually help them to implement the standard. So not only were they buying the book for $50, they were paying me in some cases up to €10,000 to come into the company and advise them on the implementation of the standard. Now, this was during the last period of my life, the period of 20 years up to my early 70s, when I was a full-time writer. And although I had given up employment, I was actually making more money during this time than I had when I had a combined writing and a very good salary, because being able to write full-time meant that I was free to write anything I wished. As a journalist, I concentrated on the pharmaceuticals, chemicals and timber industries, and wrote about major companies in this industry. And at this stage I really perfected the art of being a journalist. I got to the stage where I got the press officers in major chemicals and pharmaceuticals and timber companies to send me directly any press releases they had or any news. Now, each of these press releases would have the number and other contact details of the press officer. And I was looking for stories mainly about new product development, which is always very saleable. I would be able to accept the press releases, which they sent me by email, and if I needed a quotation, an extra quotation, to go back to the press officer and to speak to some management person. But all I was actually doing was I was taking the press release, which had its story in it, and just rewriting the story in my own words and submitting it to a very large online magazine. The one for the chemicals and pharmaceuticals industry was called The Alchemist. And for the timber, I was writing for an international timber magazine, which was still a paper magazine in printed form. The reason that the online Alchemist could actually pay me was that they were selling other services in the way of marketing and other kinds of information to the industry, and they were helping their customers by supplying them with a free magazine for which they needed writers. Now, I was paid very well by this online source, up to $1,000 or €1,000 each week when I was in full swing. In my early 70s, with the blessings of my dear late wife, I gave up writing for money and I concentrated on doing voluntary work, mainly in the area of human rights. At first I was working for a small number of men whom I believed, or I was led to believe, had been falsely and wrongfully imprisoned. Managed to help to get one of them released. But in support of this work I had a website, and the website was dealing with the human rights issues that I was concerned with. This website attracted the attention of some British families that were fleeing from the United Kingdom, mostly coming to Ireland, to try and stop social workers from wrongfully seizing their children and putting them into foster care. And I started to help these families, and I started to set up a network to help them, especially to help them to go to the High Court in Ireland and to get judges to support them in keeping their children. Now, this completely changed my life, because after an initial visit from BBC Radio 4 and a radio programme in which I was featured, the television crews began to come to my house, which was at the time where my wife and I had retired to a fairly remote old farmhouse in County Wexford. And I had, visiting me, I had BBC crew came twice. I had RTE, the National Irish Television Network, and their top current affairs or an investigative programme known as Primetime. I had crew from Danish television. I was mentioned on Latvian TV. I had a large crew from Polish national television, from Czech broadcasting, and a visit from Moscow, from Russia Today, which of course went global. And I heard from as far away as California, California, yes, but also the Argentine. Now, around this time, my son had started a YouTube channel, and he had monetized it, which meant that he had enough views that he was making a small amount of money from advertising. So we set up on this channel, we set up a news section for documentaries and news, because one of these programs, one of these television crews ran into trouble with the British courts, which was Russia Today, and the court threatened that they would shut down and confiscate the bureau of Russia Today in London if they didn't withdraw one of the videos they'd made with me, because in the video they had named the concert pianist who had sought my help and whose son was taken into custody, and they named the son and shown him. And it was illegal to show a child or to name a child, which meant that you couldn't always tell the whole story. So they had in fact had to take the video down, although by this stage it had gone worldwide and had been seen by millions. But because of this, I began to find local, which I had no trouble finding, local actors, all actresses as it turned out, local women who worked for amateur dramatic societies and amateur theatres, and who with considerable enthusiasm acted for me. And we made a number of videos about the work, the things that the British social services were doing. And these actresses acted as if they were mothers, and we even used some of their children as actors. And we'd say at the beginning of the video, we'd say that because of legal constraints, we are using a dramatic representation of the story, and it's being done with actors and actresses. And this made it legal. This meant that we could film the subject. Now each of these videos, each of these documentaries would get up to 6,000 or 7,000 views on our YouTube channel. But we also use them for another purpose. We also use them to send them to independent freelance filmmakers and directly to companies like the BBC and other major television companies as tasters or teasers. In other words, the picture being worth 1,000 words. And what would happen then would be that the producer would look at it, and if he liked it, he wouldn't use it as it was, but he would send his own crew and make his own documentary, which meant that instead of getting 7,000 views, the documentary in which I did not write or produce, but which I would feature because they would come and film me and I would talk to the camera. But that documentary would have millions of views. Okay, so now, what am I now doing? Well, a little over 1 year ago, as a widower, and I had been a widower for 7 years of the time that I was working with the families. In fact, working with the families that were in trouble was giving me a reason for living after I lost my dear wife. But a little over a year ago, I lost my sight. And now I was no longer in a position where I could read emails or do any kind of decent documentary work. So I started making podcasts, which is what I'm now doing. So now you could say, am I not now doing the very thing that I started off saying that one should never do? Am I not now engaging in vanity publishing? Well, my answer to that is that because my son, who owns the channel that this is on, is monetized, there's always the possibility that we could make what every writer nowadays wants to also achieve, which is the bestseller, which is a viral documentary or a viral video. So there's always the good intention of making the viral video. But the second reason is that after 60 years of writing, for the reasons I've given, I think perhaps I deserve a bit of vanity. I hope you agree with me.
Produced by Rothery Media.